lunchtime seminar. Great to see such a nice turnout. Now, household energy consumption behaviour and community energy systems are both topics very dear to us in CES and in the Resolve programme in the Sustainable Lifestyles Research Group at CES. So what better than to have a project which brings together motivations for household energy saving, but also the possibility of exploring whether a community level engagement can amplify motivation, amplify energy saving effects. And that's the project that's going to be described to us today by our guest speakers, Dr. Büchs and Dr. Bardsley from Southampton and Reading Universities. It sounds, I've heard a bit about it over lunch, it sounds really fascinating, something that we may well want to follow up on. I can imagine some interesting collaborations coming out of it actually, so look forward very much to hearing what you've got to say. So over to you.
Right, okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting us. It's very good to be here. This is joint work with a long list of people across various faculties. So we have political scientists, civil engineers, and I'm the economist. So we're going to talk about initial effects of a community-based initiative for energy saving. This is funded by research councils, EPS lastly should be there as well. And at the start we were all based at the University of Southampton, but since then we've been scattered in various directions. Well, I'm based at the University of Reading, some of us are now based at Exeter and Westminster. And we're interested in behavioural change for a couple of reasons. So this is motivated by environmental interests, so our group are interested in climate change and also energy scarcity issues. And so we're basically interested in behaviour change, both in its own right, in the potential that there would be for energy use reduction, for emissions reduction through behaviour change. But also because if we don't account for behaviour and behaviour change when we conduct technical interventions, they may backfire. So this is a picture of the rebound effect, probably most people here are familiar with. This is taken from the warm front evaluation study, where you had a programme of interventions for thermal efficiency of dwellings initiated under the last Labour government, targeted at specific vulnerable groups, so unemployed people, pregnant women and elderly people and so on, were able to get a package of interventions to improve the performance of their buildings. And what they found was that prior to the interventions, people were sort of crowded in one room around a very inefficient gas fire. And after a package of interventions, loft insulation, new central heating, cavity wall insulation and so on, it became cheaper to heat a room, so many of the participants were heating more rooms or for longer, and measured energy use in the evaluation study actually increased on average. So partly because of that comfort taking, but also there was some doubt about the actual technical measures that were undertaken. So that's an additional reason that we're interested in this project in behavioural change. We're also interested in focusing on the community and community group dimension. So it seems to be something approaching a consensus in academic opinion that merely providing people with information is not a very effective way of changing behaviour, partly because of modern phenomenon of information overload, which you see in this picture. And there's been a lot of interest around more interactive ways of getting information across, getting people to engage with information. And more recently there's been a lot of interest in the concept of social practices, and in particular whether these can be transformed via social interaction involving community groups. So that's one of our key research focuses in this project. There's just some references there of some of the academic literature that's just behind them. So there's a lot of interest in this kind of hypothesis, but it seems to us there's not a lot of hard evidence. So a lot of the academic work that's been done around this type of question has been using self-reports of behaviour. So it seemed to us that there wasn't a lot of hard evidence about this. So the key aim of our project is to go out and collect some. So what we're doing in this project is we have a similar intervention in some ways to the warm front intervention. So we're improving efficiency of thermal dwellings. But we're also combining that, and this is our experimental manipulation, with a community group behavioural intervention. So we have a matched case and control trial. So we match two areas in the southeast of England using ONS super output area classification. And we take a different group to the one studied by Warmfront. So Warmfront is looking at vulnerable households. We're looking at middle income households, because vulnerable we think has already been done. And those are both the treatment and control settlement are classified as prospering suburbs. So super output area classification 4A. And in the treatment group, in the control group, we have households who only have a home insulation upgrade, and they also have energy measurement devices to measure direct energy use in the home. And then that's supplemented with self-reports on travel and broader consumption behaviour. And those are updated every 4 months throughout the duration of the project. In the treatment group, you have the same set of measures, but in addition, there's interaction with a community greening group. And the data is collected over a period of 3 years. We aimed for a sample size of 200 households. It took so long to recruit the households that we weren't able to quite manage that. So we ended up with an initial sample size of 180 households. We also have done qualitative data collection, so interviews with project participants. But also there's a second stream to the work, which is qualitative work looking at comparable initiatives. So we looked at 7 similar initiatives across the country, collecting qualitative interview data. Okay, so this is just some information about the building intervention. So we had an insulation offer which was worth about £1,000 to £1,500. There was a government subsidy available to help with the cost of that. And we were only doing the things which appeared more successful from what we knew from the Warmfront study. So we concentrated on loft insulation and cavity wall insulation. We weren't doing the boiler upgrades and heating system upgrades that Warmfront did. The energy monitors is a piece of kit called LearnMe, which it's web-based, but it attaches to the clamp on an individual's electricity supply, and then there are also temperature sensors, and also it can measure the boiler runtime of the household. Okay, so you get information on whether the boiler's on and off, information on electricity use, and also temperature from the temperature sensors for each household in the study. Now the behavioural intervention, and this is what I'm going to concentrate on today, This is what we wanted the behavioural intervention to be. We wanted a genuine involvement of a community greening group, so for them not to be merely acting as our puppets. We wanted it to be not too fancy, so that it could be something that in principle could be adopted by government or local authorities working with similar groups in other areas. And we wanted the information that the community group was working with to be well informed, so it informed our research. And the outcome of negotiating that with the group was a commitment by the community group to run a minimum of one householder meeting per year, which was co-planned with us. In addition to that, there was a certain level of spontaneous action that the group set up themselves. So they set up an energy user group to meet more frequently to discuss with households ideas about how they could reduce their home energy use and other aspects of their energy use. We would have liked a bit more of that, but we'll come on later in the presentation to talk about challenges of working with community groups. Okay, so this is a preliminary results of the presentation. Ideally, we would have liked to just run the project for 3 years, then collect and analyse the data and report it. But that doesn't seem to be possible in today's university. So we're under pressure to produce some results right from the beginning of the project. So we're talking about measuring a pulse in energy use around the timing of the intervention meetings. So if these meetings and so on are having an effect on energy use, we would expect there to be a sign of that around the time when the households are getting together and interacting with the community group. Okay. So the main research questions, which I'm not able unfortunately to talk about today because we haven't got all the data in, are about energy use over the 3-year period using the comprehensive measures. But today's presentation is about something more limited. If such intervention does make a difference, we'd expect to see a pulse at the time of the main household meetings. So we're going to talk specifically about the first meeting. And the topic was, first of all, home energy use, so spatial heating and electric power. We were also telling people how they could look at or monitor their home energy use using the monitoring equipment and the website that Alert Me runs, which stores all the data. But also broadening out from that, we also talked about the wider context in terms of climate change and also broader aspects of energy use. So doing things like ranking exercises where people would compare energy savings, say from not taking a flight to not driving a mile to buying local and organic food and so on, to get people interacting with that information. We also told them about the rebound effect. So the broader research question there, which again we're not able to address today, is do people still rebound if they're aware of the rebound effect? And we also gave them some take-home actions. So these were the main 3: reducing the thermostat setting by 1 degree Celsius, not leaving appliances on when not in use, and not leaving things on standby. So these are our results. So this is the data taken from temperature sensors. So we're using here the lounge temperature as a proxy for spatial heating use. And you've got a time series of lounge temperatures in the participant group in blue and in the control group in black. And we're looking at differences for 4 weeks before versus 4 weeks after the event. And basically, there may be a very small effect there, but it's statistically definitely not significant. So we don't observe any measurable pulse on spatial heating use. On the right hand side, you've got, on a different scale, you've got the ambient temperature, and you see that it seems to be that the time series of lounge temperatures is tracking fairly closely movements in the ambient temperature. For power, so again we've got two time series. This is electrical power use, measured by the energy monitoring equipment. We were a bit more encouraged by this diagram. So there may be a pre-existing difference between the two groups on power, but it seemed to us that there's a clearer separation after the event. So there are 4 time series on here. So this is the comprehensive energy use at the top. And at the bottom we've separated out always on or base load power. So there's absolutely no difference in base load power, but there may be a difference in discretionary electricity usage around the time of the event. So to measure that, we again take a differences and differences measure. So here you've got the difference before and after the event over a 4-week period in the participants, the intervention group that went to the community meetings and so on. And here you've got the same measure in the control group that didn't have any meetings with the community greening group. And you remember, as time goes on, the temperature's getting colder. So people tend to stay indoors more and use appliances more as you head into the heating season. So that's why in both groups electricity use is increasing, but it may be increasing slightly less dramatically in the participant group. So we look at that formally using a differences and differences measure. As I said, there are various problems working actually with the data from the energy monitoring equipment. Because these are web-based, they're vulnerable to people's modems going down, for example. Okay, so there are lots of data points where you don't have very many time points underlying the observations. And those have a much higher variance than the higher quality data points. So we've taken a fairly brutal approach and screened out anything with less than 50% of the data in this diagram. Doing that would be significant on two-sample, two-tailed t-test, Satterthwaite's test. But it's important to remember that such a test is not very accurate when it's possible that the distributions you're sampling from are skewed. Okay, so we conduct a non-parametric, this is a permutation test on trimmed means, 10% trimmed means. It's only marginally significant at the 10% level. Okay? So we're not very confident in that respect. But the estimated differences and differences is about 30 watts, which is non-negligible. So were you to observe 30 watts over a year, that would be about 5% of the national average annualised household rate of power usage. So on the one hand, there may be something quite substantial, but we couldn't infer that with great confidence because of the amount of variation in the data. So I'm able to hand over to Milena, who will talk a bit more about the qualitative side of these.
Yes, thank you. So the idea was that although the experiment tells us whether or not there's a difference between the two groups, it can't necessarily tell us why or how the behavioural intervention made a difference. So that's why we conducted qualitative interviews as well with participants in 7 other community initiatives that are quite similar to the one we are working with. And that's what I'm very briefly just reporting about, sort of trying to distill some of the responses in terms of, well, what kind of difference does taking part in a community group make to people and people's behaviour. And especially how does that link to the theories that are out there in the literature already about the role that participating in a community group can play for behaviour change. So I'd like to just try to summarise these theories in three main categories. So one is about you could say, the processing of information. So as Nick already said, I think there's already evidence that if you just have a broad brushed sort of government campaign, or even if it's an NGO-based campaign, that they are not usually very effective in changing people's behaviour. But one idea is that if information is given in a more sort of deliberative context, where people talk about it, exchange ideas, etc., that it does make more of a difference. And of course also if it's more targeted to a specific audience. And the other aspect in there might be trust as well. So quite a few authors, and one has to say also third sector organisations themselves, claim that the trust that people put into third sector organisations or voluntary organisations makes a difference to how they perceive information. So that they're more sceptical basically about information that comes from the government or comes from big businesses. So they trust people more if they hear it from people who they perceive as similar to themselves. The second sort of theory could be termed around social norms. So the idea that social norms are maintained and also generated through interaction. So it's nothing. So social norms aren't just out there somewhere, but they are basically created and maintained through interaction. And this idea, which actually is around for quite a long time now, sort of Kurt Lewin's research on people who are given information in small groups, and that was much more successful in changing their behaviour than information just given to them through kind of a leaflet, let's say. And the idea here is that people can observe what other people are doing, and that you have this direct sort of peer pressure on you as well. So you sense what the expectation is, and you respond to it if you're a part of this group. And the third set of theories is around addressing this problem of self-efficacy. So this idea that people might not engage in certain behaviours if they think that they alone don't really have an impact on changing the problem. And the idea that being part of a group might address that problem. So what we've done, conducted 62 interviews with participants in 7 other community groups, which we, as we already said, conducted similar behavioural programs targeted at energy use. And I just wanted to show you a couple of quotes that seem to suggest that there's some support for these different theories. So the first two here really talk about sort of conversations that people had with other members of the group, and how that encouraged them to actually change their behaviour. I'll give you a moment to just look at especially these two. So the first really says she wasn't into that at all, and then she heard certain ideas about what she could do, and she took them away and realised yes, she could do that, and now that she's completely changed, she says she's converted and engages in a lot more little actions to save energy in comparison to before. And the other one is also about hearing about the feed-in tariff, and that might link over to this theme of trust. So receiving information from someone about how good at this time, that is, I think before it got reduced actually, how good that tariff was, etc., that encouraged him to actually install solar panels. And it's interesting how he said, they knew about this already, but hearing it from someone from the group, that made the difference. And the third one especially, I think, relates to this theme of trust. So this is someone who was quite sceptical of government policies, and he says he would have probably not have listened to the calls of the preaching and teaching, which is quite interesting, had I not been part of this group. So being part of this group made him much more open to the messages given. Also, there seems to be some evidence supporting this idea that social norms are generated and maintained within small interactive groups. Even though people don't express it directly in this way, I think one can interpret some of these quotes along these lines. So phrases like "they act as a reminder," to me sort of suggests that there's, it expresses something about what they feel the expectation is towards them from the group to behave in certain ways. Also this quote here about it puts a little bit of pressure on you, so positive pressure. It's also interesting how it's expressed. It's not negative pressure in terms of being pushed, but it's a positive, encouraging pressure coming from the group. That one sounds maybe a bit more negative, but I think sort of it's pushing you to consider certain things, but you have the freedom to go with it or not. So again, sort of social norm aspect here. And then finally, this theme of self-efficacy and as we would like to add also emotion. So these quotes here are quite interesting in terms of the emotional side that people address here. So saying that being part of the group bolsters you up a bit, encourages you, addresses feelings of helplessness and depression, because, so for this person, for example, because they feel they've become a part of the solution rather than being part of the problem. Also here about not feeling alone and engaging in this kind of activity. So I'm not just a freak of nature that's doing these crazy things by myself, so realizing there are other people out there as well. So that, I think, these quotes are quite interesting and support these theories. However, we feel, and Nick will say a few words about this, that when it comes to the sort of conceptualization of self-efficacy, it's quite interesting to think about, well, how should we and how could we conceptualize it, because it tends to be, the focus tends to be quite individualistic still. And Nick, do you want to
so
say a few words?
when I read these quotes, it took me back to things that I was studying as a PhD student in economics. So I wouldn't have naturally interpreted what people had said in terms of self-efficacy at all. So I think it's interesting to ask about perhaps bringing some other theoretical perspectives to the qualitative work. So in economics, basically mainstream economics has a big problem with collective action. And so for any economists in the room, they might be aware of sort of Paul Samuelson's work on public goods. It basically says that you can't provide collective goods through spontaneous action. It has to be done by a coercive authority like the government. Okay. So they can explain failures of collective action. They can't explain successful collective action or why people voluntarily contribute to collective actions. But there are some sort of less standard theories come out from behavioural economists, or less orthodox behavioural economists, which try to explain why people sometimes do contribute to collective actions. Okay, so the two best known are theories by game theorist Robert Sugden, so the reciprocity theory, and Michael Bacharach has a theory of team agency. So those are kind of limited theories, and in particular they don't have the emotional aspect dealt with that you get in psychology. But they focus on the means-end relationship, so the actions are still seen as instrumental, but not in an individualistic way. So people contribute because they think that the group will be successful if enough people form acts of contribution. But just reflecting on that then, that it's not clear to me that means-end aspect is well conceptualised in some of the psychological theories. because they again tend to be individualistic. So is it really self-efficacy that people feel is being boosted when they contribute to actions which are supposed to help something like global warming, which is a global public good? So it seems to me that certainly being part of a joint effort may reduce feelings of powerlessness, and we have some evidence for that in the qualitative data that we collected. But if you reflect on the nature of the case, it seems to me that it's the prospect of joint success which matters, and that's something rather different from the prospect of individual success, which is the self-efficacy concept. So this is particularly clear if you think about work that's been done in public choice theory on voting. So public choice theorists say that the more people vote, the less effective your vote is likely to be, because you have less chance of influencing the outcome. And then you get these arguments which are reflected in sort of popular political discourse, saying that, well, if you vote for if you're in a non-marginal constituency and you vote for a minor party, then that's a wasted vote, because you can't influence the outcome. But what's interesting is that from the perspective of affecting the outcome, you could run the same argument in a non-marginal constituency for voting with the majority party. But people don't feel that voting for the majority party is a wasted vote. Okay, so reflecting on that, it seems to be that it's the prospect of joint success that matters, and that's something different from individual self-efficacy. So it seems to me that in these alternative economic theories, that they're thinking about a situation something like this, that if there's a prospect of successful collective action, then that can feed into an individual motive to contribute. So in the reciprocity theory, the individual participants are acting because of their obligations to the other members of the shoal, if you like. And in the team agency theory, it's that it's their group identity of being part of the bigger fish that's sort of driving the individual actions. So there'd be, in economic terms, a sort of stable configuration of individual actions motivated by the prospect of group success. But if the situation is more like this, then you wouldn't necessarily be able to get the same individual motivations. So I think it's important to put a sort of question mark against, are we really getting to the heart of what's driving these individual motivations? Because if the prospect of collective success is important to people who are doing these minor contributions, in the wake of continuing political failure to act on climate change and lack of structural reforms, that might impact on whether these things are permanent gains or not, or whether they're likely to be ephemeral. So, conclusions. So from my part, the quantitative part of the study, we estimated a 30 watts reduction in power use using a differences in difference measure over 4 weeks either side of the behavioural intervention. From the time series, if that's true, it seemed to be sustained over a 15-week period. But we can't infer that with any confidence because of the amount of variation in the data. There was no evidence on the effects of heating energy. So it seemed to me that what we could be observing is people doing the low-cost actions, like turning things off when they're not in use, in terms of electrical power. So our initial data suggests potential savings from community-based interventions. The further work, when we get more data in, will examine rebound effects of free interventions over 3 years, and also more work on the qualitative aspects.
Indeed, yes. And as I said, so our qualitative material definitely suggests that there's support for these ideas around how information is distributed in smaller groups and deliberation about information, that's more effective than running broad brush campaigns. The idea of social norms, and potentially also addressing this self-efficacy efficacy problem with the constraints that Nick has just discussed about, well, how sustainable in a way is that if the prospects of being successful in the long term are potentially not given. What we haven't done is sort of systematically seeing which of these theories is the most plausible one or whatever. I think they're all overlapping to a certain extent, and some mechanisms might be more important in some initiatives than in others, but we haven't gone yet to sort of compare different types of intervention to see which ones are more important for which type of initiative. But so that's a work outstanding. But for the moment, we assume that they sort of support each other to a certain extent. So we've talked about there's some scope for sort of reconceptualizing some of these theories. I think it's quite an interesting thing to think about the role of emotions in there as well, because that's a sort of under-researched area, I think, and the extent to which community groups can address, or not necessarily address directly maybe, but the role that expressing emotions, discussing emotions, etc. plays in these community groups, and how that helps people be motivated, engaging, and maybe even changing some of their values that they, their identities basically, and what they regard important for them. And obviously the final question here is really about what we would like to come out with at the end is really about, well, what is the scope of having programs like that rolled out through third sector organisations? And at the moment it's not quite clear to us what the scope is, to be honest. So in some sense I think it's difficult to say at the moment, how successful it would be, because it also depends on the scenario that you're looking at. Okay, I think we finish here and look forward to your questions, really.
Thank you. Elaine, thank you very much indeed for that. Fascinating. There's a lot of resonance with work that we've done in CES and in sociology and psychology, and the Resolve programme, the Isolation programme. So I'm sure there'll be many comments and questions, but also I can think of quite a few areas where we could do some follow-up work and put you in touch with a few of the people, such as MHD students who are working in this area. So thank you very much for that. We've got about 20 minutes. We'd like to kick off. Matt.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited about your study. We've done some work using a learning kit in a similar sort of basis, but with an order of magnitude fewer participants and an order of magnitude shorter time frame. And I know how difficult it is keeping the kit and keeping the measurements going, so it's very impressive. One of the things that for me is most exciting is the length of time that you've got this monitoring taking place for. And you refer to some of Tom Hargreaves and Jackie Burgess's work at UEA, and one of the things I know that they found in some of their work on smart metering interventions was how quickly the initial effectiveness or the initial impact of some of the interventions kind of dissipated over time. Now, I think you said on your second to last slide that some of the impact you had observed on the electricity side seemed to have remained in place for at least 15 weeks or so. Is the ability to look at how long effectiveness of interventions lasts, is that a kind of a core part of the study as you get a longer sample of data? Because that does seem to me to be a particularly important one, and it's a place where obviously community energy may be very effective, and that you can kind of somehow keep on going back to people and keep reminding them.
I would say ideally yes, in fact that's one of our goals. I'm not sure how easy it would be to deliver on that because of the cumbersome nature of the alert me data and the outages and so on. So it's a challenge, even if in theory the data is there, working with it is difficult, as you know. So we've got a problem. You get one pulse, one sort of reading coming out from a household every few seconds. Okay, so over 3 years, that's an enormous quantity of data. It's ridiculous over-collection of data, in fact. We've really shot ourselves in the foot with having this massive data set to downsize before we can work with it.
The potential is there, I would say, but yes, you've seen the figures about missing data as well, and that's quite unevenly distributed as well. So it's not always the same households who sort of drop off and come in again. It's quite spread across the sample. So yes, but yes.
The good thing about it is it's missing at random, as far as we can tell. So statistically, it's good missing.
I was just wondering actually about how representative you feel that those who are participating in the study are of the general population. Have people chosen to be involved because they have pre-existing interest in environmental issues, or so is that all saving money, or?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I don't think we make any claims about representativeness of the population. I would say we would hope that they're representative of people involved in these kinds of initiatives. I mean, we should maybe explain how we recruited people to the experiment, which is in the intervention group. They were actually recruited through this pre-existing greening group that was already active in that area. So, through mail shots and even door knocking, etc. So, and quite a lot through networks from this existing group. But actually, probably not everyone has been previously engaged with that group. So in that sense, the intervention group is possibly a bit different actually to some of the other groups we've been working with. And the other group has just been recruited through the insulation company, who has just mail shot this whole area. So, what we try to stimulate is like a program being rolled out by an insulation company or the government or whatever.
I would say we would like them to be representative of the subpopulation, namely the prospering suburbs classification.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we matched the prospering suburbs areas because we wanted them to be comparable from a socio-demographic point of view. And I mean, other initiatives we've been looking at, some of them like low carbon zones, or we had another sort of home energy, an initiative that provides sort of home energy assessments, and they've also more or less sort of recruited people, through door knocking and leafleting. So yes, so I don't know. It's a bit difficult to say because what makes you being involved in such an initiative? I think there needs to probably be a certain kind of interest.
But we did also collect some data on environmental attitudes and so on before.
Yes.
About a few weeks into the project.
It was fairly early on. Yeah.
And from that.
Well, I think the two groups are fairly similar in terms of, so we asked them about their attitudes to climate change generally, and I think there are no significant differences between these two groups at least. So in that sense we can be fairly confident that the intervention group is not very different in terms of their environmental attitudes to the other group at least. Yes.
Hey, just a couple of questions. First one related to the last question about kind of the representativeness of the sample, and I was wondering, did you, was everybody who took part in this project actually a homeowner, or did you include people from the rental sector as well? Because, I mean, I'm sort of reviewing a lot of this literature in this area at the moment, and it seems that for quite understandable reasons, researchers are focusing very much on their home ownership, because these are the people who've got the agency to actually kind of make an intervention in their own home, but that kind of also leaves quite a big gap in the data in terms of the rental market as well. And the second question was regarding the smart data, smart meter data. Some quite interesting work came out of Tyndall, Manchester, which looked at the positioning of smart meters in people's homes, and looking at kind of the impact it has depending on how visible it is and stuff. And I was wondering if you actually collected data on sort of where the smart meters were positioned in people's homes.
They're not really smart meters, so this is really a web-based piece of kit.
Okay.
So if you've got an alert me, you can go to a website where you can download time series or sort of trace, they call it, of your power consumption. There is another bit of kit which is a display that links to the Alert Me hub that tells you how much energy you're using at that particular point in time. And we may be able to access some data because that also has a sensor on it. So that's another ambition to
we haven't
extract this
got
data.
them yet, but yes, we have given them to them and we've recorded when they got them. I'm not sure whether we've recorded where they've put
No,
it.
we haven't.
And so on. But it's a good question because we have another outstanding survey obviously at the end, so we might have a question there, and I think we already discussed this, to ask about, you know, did they look at it and where was it placed? So that's interesting to follow up. And in response to the question about home ownership, yes, they're all homeowners. Partly because we had the insulation as part of the intervention, so we needed to be able to, you know, for them to have the power over their homes. So we didn't want to negotiate with landlords or whatever. But I totally agree that that's obviously a huge gap in both in the research and actually in practice as well, to deal with the rented sector.
So I say it's almost inevitable in a study like this. You know, it's a very hard job, if it's possible at all, to get landlords to do this, because they would normally bear any costs and the tenant gets the benefits.
Yeah, I'd like to focus on the research design, because you said the data is preliminary, so some of the assumptions, because I thought that a lot of what you said is really in dialogue with neoliberalism in various ways. So you've started talking about behavioural change and behavioural interventions, which is amenable to criticism of methodological individualism, and then you talked about how you introduce social practices as to overcome that in a sense, but it wasn't very clear about how you operationalise social practices in the actual research. And then the concept of self-efficacy I thought was quite interesting, especially it sort of reminded me of Slavoj Zizek, an alternative way of maybe thinking about it in terms of dissociation of action from effect, which is more of a political project in his case, in what he argues, and is basically offers the grounds for any sort of collective action or any sort of initiative for civic action on the part of citizens. And which brings me to the third aspect because I thought a lot of what you said could have bear analogies to social movements and civic action. Obviously, in your case, that wasn't, these people did not self-organize. You actually put their groups together. But I was thinking that what you were saying, that the topics of the group meetings seemed to tap into ideas of responsible citizenship, and whether it would be worth sort of, in a non-explicit way, addressing issues of what participants' take is on different levels of governance, community versus centralised government, and whether they think that again goes back to sort of the dissociation of action from effect, to whether they think that they can actually incur changes.
Yes, yeah. No, that's quite interesting. I mean, I think we've, when we sampled the 7 other community groups, which are all self-organised community groups to a certain extent, we tried to have a bit of variation in there as to how democratically run they are, if that makes sense. So the low carbon zone, for example, that particular one, that's the local authority there was quite leading in organising it, and so that was a more sort of top-down approach. And we had other initiatives in there that were more sort of bottom-up organised. So we tried to have a bit of variation there. We haven't yet analysed the qualitative data as to how responsive people were to the different approaches, and whether that decision-making setup makes a difference to how people interact with the group. But it's a really interesting question, and I think Claire Saunders is very interested in the social movements aspect, in the whole project. So that's that. The social practices, yes. Well, there's an interesting split sort of, you know, that because we are so interdisciplinary in the project, and I mean, I'm a sociologist, and I think when I analyse the qualitative data, I'm very much coming from the social practices perspective, and for me it's less about operationalisation probably, but more about what I see in the data and how I read the data and how I understand what people say. So of course we ask them about, you know, how they live their lives, and that included things about the things they deal with and infrastructures and their motivations and meanings that they attach to certain behaviours. So all these elements of practices that are often talked about in the practices literature, I think we try to capture them in the interviews and try to work with that as well. So we've just written another paper, for example, on the role of motivations and energy usage. So this thing about, you know, does it make a difference if they're motivated by money saving compared to if they're sort of true, let's say, environmentally motivated. And we seem to see a difference there, which is really quite interesting. And so we come to that from a social practices perspective.
So I was just going to ask about, motivations and the economic and the environmental point of view. Do you think, I mean, I would assume that if you look at different social groups, you would get different answers to that question. So
Yes.
do you think in this research that you've done, have you looked at that, and what's the most, like, so in your community groups, is it better to give information about money savings or actually climate change? So I was interested in what you said about like prospective joint success as a motivator, and sort of how do people qualify success in this sort of situation? Is it them reducing their energy bills, or is it stopping global warming, or do you know?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it partly comes back to neoliberalism, I guess. And none of us as researchers would self-identify, I don't think, with neoliberalism. But nonetheless, as a kind of dominant ideology, it's sort of out there. And I think one effect of that is that the community group finds it easier to engage people around topics like technology and money saving than it would with, say, political engagement or, you know, those kinds of things.
That's from the organisers. So that was what we were quite surprised to find when we talked to the organisers. That a lot of them said, you know, we have to advertise what we do through this money-saving argument, because they thought they couldn't otherwise engage enough people. But we found quite striking differences talking to individuals taking part in these initiatives, and there seems to be a pattern that if people do it for the money-saving, especially if they're fairly well off, that they restrict their actions to quite limited things. Yeah, it's sort of switching off the lights or turning down the thermostat, but they're perfectly happy to still fly across the world for their holidays and don't question that at all. Whereas people who are quite environmentally motivated have a very different approach to that and take a much broader approach to their environmental behaviour. And what's interesting then is to look at low-income households as well, because we found that we found some sort of not very well-off householders who took on these green narratives to actually almost justify their, you know, low consumption. So they almost turned it into something positive to actually justify that they don't have a car, they don't fly, but that was turned into something positive. Now they,
Just point out before we finish that we're still working with this community group, so
yes.
if there are any bloggers here, don't go away and write something. We're very critical about this community.
We haven't named it, but yes, it would be good not to go too public with it at the moment. So.
Got time for one more before we finish if anything's got might be one to make.
Just want to make a point on the efficacy. I think you brought out very nicely that it might be group efficacy going on there, or self-efficacy. Self-efficacy might be just the, you know, I'm able to do something I now know, something I can do, not quite knowledge, but feeling the power to do it. And I think, so you brought out very nicely the idea of group efficacy. You were saying that there might be an issue there about the duration that might last. And I think just say a little bit, sort of sound a note of caution that that's still very much a sort of rational utility model of we're doing it because until we get this. And the other factors that you mentioned, like identity, particularly group identity and values, might be also motivators that people don't necessarily present correctly.
Well, I agree with that. There's going to be quite a complex mix of motivations. We come along with our analytical toolkit and it doesn't really do justice to concrete reality.
That's partly, I think, what Nick meant is it's still a means-end model. Even the group, if you talk of group efficacy, let's say, it's still in this sort of ends-means logic. But yes, looking at what role do sort of underlying values and so on play, that could extend that, I think, quite considerably. So.
Okay, well, we'll have to draw a close there, but that was fascinating, so thank you very much. There were so many resonances with lots of work that's going on. Matt's work on pathways to low carbon economy, the work that we've been doing on rebound effects, the work on Alexia's work on transition towns, lots of work on the motivation of individuals, how it can be amplified by community effects. So I think we should stay in touch on all of those things. And can we invite you back once you've driven through your wall of data, which is amazing. Will you come back and keep us posted about how this is unfolding? Because it seems like a really important study and very interesting methodologically as well. So thank you very much, Steve, for coming on.
Thank you.